So I'm an ethicist, an organizational designer, and a trust researcher. And I suppose the big question that my work exists in relation to, which is so closely aligned to your work, Philippa, is something like how might we best design organizations, technologies, and systems at large that contribute to a healthy and dignified life for all within planetary boundaries. And in doing that, I draw on many branches of philosophy, the cognitive sciences, general systems science or general systems theory, and a number of other disciplines. And I suppose what I'm attempting to do is bring together many different uh, ways of seeing the world and attempting to know the world so that we can ask very big questions like, what is it that truly matters? And work together to figure out how we do more of what truly matters and less of what doesn't. And it's a little bit of a different way to describe what an ethicist does, but I feel that this particular direction that I've taken is one that is sorely needed at this time between worlds that we find ourselves in right now. Yeah, I can, recognizing that I'm not Sauron and I don't have the one ring to rule them all. And it's important to recognize also, Philippa, like many, I suppose, areas within philosophy or discourses or dialogues within philosophy, there isn't a broadly agreed definition. I would suggest that morals, even though morals and ethics or morality and ethics have similar sort of like a similar etymological basis, I define a distinction between the two, and I think it's practically helpful. So morals are something like our first order beliefs about what is good and right. Ethics is almost like the second order process. So it's this deliberative process that we undertake in a given situation to reflect on those first order moral beliefs and ask questions like, well, in this situation, given what we know, given what we don't know, given who's involved, given who might be impacted, given who might be disproportionately impacted, what's the good and right thing to do? And how do we do that well? And how do we keep observing it so that we know like that process that we undertake, that is ethics. And the reason, there's a number of reasons I like that sort of definition, but one is that it's really practical because you step back. Sometimes when folks hear that, they go, oh, I kind of do that. I'm already doing that. And it makes what is often a very esoteric discipline or idea closer to our everyday realities. And I find that through that sort of approach, people become more comfortable more quickly and can get really hands-on doing the important work that we know we have to do. That is a question we've been asking for thousands of years, and there are many different answers. I think that there's something about the process of doing ethics, attempting to ask that big question, what is it that truly matters, like exploring our axiology, what we believe to be good or valuable. There's something kind of like innately human about that. Like it's just something we all do, and we tend to do sort of sociologically and dialogically in community or cultural settings. But why is ethics so important now? Well, I think if you look at the trajectory of our civilization and the ways in which our collective activities impact the one and only biosphere that we can presently rely on for life, and the ways in which it impacts how people feel about themselves, how they relate to one another, the kind of like the battle of their interiority. Um, there's so much left for us to do. And if ethics again is this process of reflecting on our first order beliefs about what we believe to be good and right, it's an opportunity to come together to ask those big questions that we often shy away from. and engage in a really integrous process to hold one another accountable, to hold institutions accountable, and practically make progress towards a better world. So in some way, there's little more that matters more than that. So I put ethics on a bit of a pedestal because I think it has so much to contribute. And I think if we're able to relate to ethics that way, um, maybe many other folks will agree too. I don't think we do ethics very often, to be honest, Philippa. So of course we have philosophy is broken down into different branches, and there isn't necessarily, excuse me, even agreement of where ethics is situated, because sometimes it falls sort of within axiology, sometimes it sits separate and it's called moral philosophy, and then it's broken down into different stuff: meta ethics, normative ethics, applied ethics, comparative ethics, yeah, right, all this stuff. But let's say we take an example that's really sort of pertinent and top of mind for a lot of folks right now. AI ethics. So AI ethics is almost like a sub-discipline, if you will, within applied ethics. And then it gets broken down into different ways. We have sort of like technical AI ethics and some other stuff like that. There's complex decision tree type of conditional logic here. A lot of the work that is done in that space is kind of like just, hey, we've got some framework, or we've got some checklists that we have to execute, or we've got some principles that we just want to reference. And although that's better than doing nothing, it's not actually doing ethics. Because again, ethics is this deliberative process where we are deeply and integrously reflecting on what we believe truly matters and attempting to align our actions to that which we believe truly matters. And there's not a lot of that going on. So in the AI ethics space, we have this thing called the ethical intent to action gap. And that's basically this phenomena where lots of organizations, public and private, generally agree on kind of like the normative orientation or some of the principles that really matter that we should be referencing when we're trying to responsibly develop and use AI systems. When you look at how significant the gap is between that general sort of like attitudinal agreement and the way that organizations behave, or the way that those principles are/aren't operationalized, it's massive. And we have some very good literature even here in Australia from a group called Fifth Quadrant, the Responsible AI Maturity Index, that very tangibly demonstrates how significant that gap is. And that's just one example. And what I think is happening, I think that the deeper pattern, Philippa, is that that's kind of playing out everywhere. And there's lots of reasons for that. This isn't to play the blame game or point fingers or anything like that. I think there's lots of issues here. There are these deep sort of ideologies that we sort of ascribe to, many unchecked or unquestioned assumptions that actually just don't stack up with our best view of how we think reality kind of works and how we're situated within that process or that system's view of life. But then also there's not a particularly wholesome relation to ethics. It's sometimes chucked into a sort of risk or business continuity or compliance category, or it's like, hey, but aren't the lawyers doing that? It's like, no, lawyers don't do ethics. Of course, moral theories and different areas of legal scholarship sometimes overlap, sometimes they conflict. So of course there's some relation, but so folks are just sort of like, oh, but someone else is doing that, right? Or and this is sometimes more dangerous because most people are kind of generally good in some way, shape, or form. And there's this sort of complex dynamical process between like the person and world, like agent or arena, and how the world is massively affects how the person is and the types of behaviors or conduct that they engage in, right? But pushing all of that complexity to the side, people go, yeah, but I'm a good person and I work for a good organization. We're ethical. And they just sort of like just throw that away. Um, and so I just don't think we're doing that much of the work. And what I would love to see is like a good hard look in the mirror, like this, like just, are we really doing a good job? No, no, really. And just dive deeper into that and sit with the discomfort that is probably going to surface. No, we're not doing the best job that we can. We're contributing excessively to systemic ecological overshoot or these negative impacts on planetary boundaries, or we're not doing a great job of really supporting and uplifting the social foundations that truly matter. Um, all right, like what do we do from here? Like, and that's the starting point, this really hard look in the mirror where we're honest with ourselves, where we engage in something like a radical self-inquiry, where we're able to then start the work. That's almost like the enabling initial condition or something like that. You could describe it as. So look, very long-winded way of saying there's nuance. This isn't about playing a blame game per se, uh, but at the same time, we're kind of just not doing the work that I think we have the opportunity and, very importantly, the ability to do really well if we choose to do it together. We have like ecological ethics. So there are formal sort of like academic subdisciplines, applied uh, areas that have been looking at this sort of stuff for a long time. Um, but I think there's maybe a tighter relationship than there ever has been. Uh, if we are to step back and do that process where we look in the mirror and we actually look into our eyes, you know what I mean? We don't look away, like we actually look into our eyes and we feel that discomfort and we go, what is it that truly matters? Am I contributing positively to what truly matters? Are we contributing positively to what truly matters? I think it should be overwhelmingly obvious, particularly in countries like Australia, we're generally speaking, overall, recognizing there's huge nuance to this, but generally speaking and overall, we are very materially privileged. We're using effectively, like in terms of our impact on planetary boundaries, and think about this in terms of Earth overshoot, we're using at least 3 times what we ought to be using. If we were to be in some type of recognizing it's always dynamical, steady state like economy, where economy and ecology exist in, again, equilibrium. I don't mean that, but all the nuances, right? So something that can actually work for a long period of time. We're a really long way out of whack. And so I think that this orientation towards the importance of coming back into balance or right relation with Gaia, becoming a healthy cell within the superorganism, many different ways in which folks frame this. I think that this deliberative process that I'm describing ethics as, which has to be done together, is almost like a fundamental enabler of the regenerative activities that we ought to be engaged in. So I think there's a very beautiful and wholesome relation. And actually, are they separate things? Maybe they're two sides of the same kind of coin. So yeah, I think the relationship's pretty tight. And for folks in the regen community, the only thing that I would say, and I have seen this playing out quite a lot, Philippa, don't just assume, right? Like check your assumptions. Do the 5 whys, dive deeper, 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 deeper. Um, it's very likely that your teleology or your goal orientation is quite normative. Like if you want to help raise social foundations and help bring our global civilization overall back within planetary boundaries, like that's a pretty defensible sort of like goal, directional goal. But at the same time, there are many different ways to try and relate to that, to try and approach that, to try and respond to that. And again, this ethics, this deliberative process, can really help us check some questionable assumptions that we might have, more actively invite really diverse voices into our processes, procedures, and ecologies of practice, and potentially through that actually help us do regeneration more quickly, more effectively, and more inclusively, very importantly. So the first part of the question is much easier to answer than the second part, because one is sort of process, the other is outcome. I can very easily describe the process. But then I can attempt to have a crack at what folks might get that's challenging to get elsewhere. So in terms of the process, so it's a 2 hour workshop, and where it goes, who knows? But for now, we're running them physically in Melbourne, and we've I've worked with Philippa and the folks at CoLabs, and we've made this decision. Um, I think as thoughtfully as we practically could. There is something qualitatively different about genuinely being together in the same place. Um, Particularly when we think about ethics as being sort of like a cognitive process where cognition is embodied, embedded, enacted, extended, emotional, and exapted, like sort of 6E CogSci. Um, Being there together, we can feel into the process in a way that's very hard to do if we're doing it online. And just really quickly, why aren't we doing it hybrid? Well, frankly, it just comes down to the difficulty of effective facilitation. If you are just facilitating remote, and you're practiced at doing that, you can do it very well. If you're just facilitating in sort of a place-based manner or co-located manner, and you're practicing that, you can do that very well. When you try and hybridize the approach, the facilitation tends to become less efficacious, and you're sort of selling the participants short a bit. And we didn't want to do that. So we're of course open to running remote stuff eventually, but we would probably want to separate the two. So just to touch on that really quickly, Philippa. So what do we do? Well, other than getting to know each other and trying to understand our orientations, like what's motivating us to be there? What are we interested in? What questions might we have? Um, because if we keep the groups relatively small, say 20 or less, I can be reasonably purposeful in integrating some of those motivations into the facilitation approach and even into the activities. So, a little bit of that stuff out of the way. We engage in two distinct activities. So we're not sort of doing like a 101 on moral philosophy. So we're not trying to replicate what you might get in the first few weeks or few months of that type of course within a university setting. That has huge value for so many people, but that's not what we're here to do. What we want to do is very briefly touch on some of that stuff and then quickly lead into hands-on practical activities. Now, the first activity is called a principle alignment session or principle alignment analysis. And what we're doing is we're taking a series of ethical principles, and I will provide you with examples, or you can bring your own. And in the first workshop, we saw people self-select, and we saw people work with some of the principles that we provided. So we used principlism, which comes from bioethics. We use the 8 principles from the Ethics Center's Principles for Good Tech work. So there were different options to just give people like a starting point. And what we're doing is we're using both a sort of like a quantitative approach and a qualitative approach. So we're using a Likert scale to basically look at, all right, if we do this thing, the thing that we want to do, so we take some real world initiative or project or motivation that we have, and we assess that relative to the principle. So we could have something like self-determination, and we assess that relative to self-determination. If it's really misaligned, it might be down towards the 1 end of the spectrum. If it's really aligned, it'll be closer towards a 7. And we go through this process and then we plot it out, and we can do it visually in different ways, ideally something like a spider plot. And then what we get is sort of like a representation of how aligned what we're proposing to do is to certain principles. Then we can see sort of like the strengths and weaknesses. We can start describing, all right, well, this principle here, the alignment's really weak, and that's very concerning for these reasons. What might we be able to do? What might we be able to change? Who might we be able to invite into the process to strengthen this, and sort of vice versa. So we go through a process like that. And folks do that individually. And there are many reasons for that. But that's kind of the first activity. The second activity is a group activity. Now, depending on how many folks are in the room with us, we'll have 3 or 4 or 5 groups, right? There are 4 to 5 people per group. And this is an activity called consequence scanning. And what we're doing is we're visually plotting basically the possibility space. What are the things that could happen if we do this thing that we say we want to do, from the very best to the very worst? And we're plotting not just like the strength or the magnitude of the consequence, like really good to really bad. We're plotting its likelihood. So we're basically assigning a probability value to it. We're assigning sort of like a marker or a tag as to whether it's intended or unintended. Because sometimes we can have like this is really a lot of folks think that like all unintended consequences are bad. Not necessarily. Sometimes unintended consequences are really good, and sometimes intended consequences are bad. Do you know what I mean? So we kind of plot that out. Um, and then we look at the order of the effect. Is it first, second, third, fourth, however far you want to go? Now that's challenging in the tight time frame that we've got, but we're basically trying to bring in almost like a complexity or a systems view, again, recognizing the constraints of a 2-hour workshop, as best we can. And so we plot that out. And then when we step back, like, and we literally step back as a group to try and sort of take that zoom out to see the woods type of situation, we go, all right, let's start describing some amplification and mitigation tactics. So what we want to do is amplify the good, like increase the likelihood, or if it's like a 5, like in terms of the like from a 1 to 10 type thing in the good category, is there a way to get that to a 7? And is there a way to get it from a probability value of 3 to like 5, right? What could we do? And then in terms of the mitigation, we're coming over to this will be the left side of the board. And we're basically going, oh, gosh, that's not real good. Like, what could we do to mitigate the likelihood of that or the severity of that? And what we end up with is like really concrete actions to kind of like enhance the like ethical preferability or defensibility of the thing that we're trying to do. And rather beautifully, Philippa, when I do that with teams in the sort of real world, that becomes like a living and breathing artifact. And you can do version control and all these different types of things. It can inform stuff like product road mapping or even corporate strategy, like how the organization sets strategy and attempts to identify and mitigate different corporate risks. Same could be done in the public service. So those are the two activities that we get like quickly hands-on stuck into. It's a very participatory process. People are encouraged to get out of what we think of as just being in our heads and actually feel into it as well. Again, recognizing that I suggest that ethics is a cognitive process where cognition is embodied, embedded, enacted, extended, emotionally exapted. You don't necessarily need to know what those things are right now. I do explain those on the night. Okay, so the second part of your question, because that was the really easy part. The second, what will you get out of it that you might not get elsewhere? So, Philippa, I'm not aware of, and I want to be very deliberate in how I suggest this. I'm not aware of a workshop series that you can attend for free that teaches these types of approaches that are sort of like verifiably practical, that we have very good reason to believe you can pretty much take to work the next day and start using. And my 13 or 14 years of doing this leads me to believe that these types of activities have anywhere between significant and transformative impacts on how an organization is oriented and how it operates. Now, that's a big claim there at the end, and that won't necessarily happen overnight. But I genuinely think I have good reason to believe that based on how I've seen these approaches adopted, integrated, operationalized, and then become very impactful within the organizations that I've had the opportunity and the fortune to work with. Thanks for having me, Philippa.